The Fukushima disaster was expected to mark a profound turning point for Japan, a moment to spur reform and reinvention, but instead of catalyzing change, it left behind disillusionment and unanswered questions. Why did this disaster fail to bring about the transformation many had hoped for? Watch until the end because there is information in here the government doesn't want you to know. In the hilly village of Iitate, in Fukushima Prefecture, stands a new community center, built with parts pulled from abandoned buildings, windows from one, doors from another, a chalkboard from a beloved school with no children to attend it. One cloudy day last autumn, a crowd gathered to celebrate its opening. As an elderly woman in a green kimono sang folk tunes, her voice riding a beat or two behind the music, the audience, a mix of locals and Tokyoites involved in the center's design, feasted on chestnut-filled rice balls. Iitate is a farming district once known for its fine beef and dried radish. In 2010, it qualified for membership of a club called Most Beautiful Villages of Japan, yet its recent history has been far from bucolic. Some 35 kilometers to the southeast, across the verdant Abukuma Mountains, stands the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. Opened in 1971, it was one of dozens built around Japan to power the post-war economy. The government offered municipalities generous subsidies for hosting the plants and promised people they posed no risks. By 2011, Japan had 54 working reactors, providing a third of the country's electricity. At 2:46 p.m. on March 11th of that year, an earthquake shook Japan's northeastern coast. The quake triggered a tsunami, sending waves as high as 40 meters crashing along 500 kilometers of coastline. Homes and roads were obliterated. Though the plant withstood the waves, its backup generators were flooded, halting the cooling water flow around its 6 reactors. Within days, 3 of them had melted down, spreading radiation across the region and panic around the world. Thousands fled their homes. A few of them went first to Iitate, but the wind carried radioactive particles in its direction. Eventually, the authorities ordered the evacuation of Iitate too. Residents were allowed to return 6 years later, but only 1,500 have done so. A fraction of the 6,200 who called it home before the disaster. The radiation effects are not visible, but I hope you can see how deeply it is felt, says Tao Yoichi of Resurrection of Fukushima, the NGO that organized the construction of the community center. The earthquake reshaped the country. Japan's biggest island moved 2.4 meters to the east. At the time, a similarly seismic shift in Japanese society was predicted. Politicians painted efforts to rehabilitate Fukushima as an emblem of a broader revival after a period of economic stagnation and demographic decline. Commentators spoke of 3/11 as the disaster came to be known, as a historical turning point, a shared experience that would shape a generation, a shock that would reinvigorate sclerotic institutions and open closed minds. Japan's post-war period had given way to a new post-disaster era, went one popular coinage. Kurokawa Kiyoshi, chairman of the parliamentary committee that investigated the disaster, spoke of 3/11 as a possible third opening akin to the abolition of the shogunate in 1868 and Japan's defeat in the Second World War. 10 years after 3/11, the third opening has yet to materialize. I expected that Japan would finally start to change, and I pinned hope on that prospect, but I'm afraid I was proven to be wrong, says Funabashi Yoichi, chairman of an independent investigation into the accident. The first instinct was just to restore, not to reform. Mr. Kurokawa agrees. No, the crisis did not change Japan. It was perhaps too much to expect a revolution. The 3/11 disaster revealed internal failings, mostly of an intractable structural sort, but also resilience. And though it battered Japan, it did not amount to complete defeat, as in the Second World War. By chance, it occurred during only the second brief period in Japan's post-war history when the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, was not in power. The Association of the Democratic Party of Japan, or DPJ, in office from 2009 to 2012, with the disaster, helped to discredit the idea of reform and political alternation. Nuclear policy was implemented for many years by the LDP, but the DPJ had to take responsibility for the disaster, says Nakabayashi Mieko, a former MP with the DPJ. Afterwards, people thought that while democracy in Japan was important, stability should have priority. There's been some change, but nothing at the pace commensurate with the promise, argues Richard Samuels, author of 3/11 A Disaster and Change in Japan. A new regulator brought stricter oversight to the nuclear industry, but the LDP remains wedded to nuclear power despite public skepticism. Disaster preparedness has improved, but the same flaws that handicapped the response to the disaster, weak central authority, lack of coordination among ministries, poor communication, bureaucratic inflexibility, persist. and the political impetus for reform has dissipated. As the LDP has regained power, the DPJ has disintegrated and apathy has set in. Miyagi and Iwate, the two other prefectures that suffered most from the earthquake and tsunami, have largely recovered. Fukushima itself has struggled. A small area is still uninhabitable. Kawata Masumi's husband's family had lived for more than 200 years in the same house in Okuma, one of the two towns next to the plant, growing persimmons, weaving silk, and brewing sake. It is now in the difficult-to-return zone, subject to 50 times more radiation than is typically considered safe. Former residents are allowed to make short visits in protective gear, but not to stay overnight. Miss Kawata, one of Okuma's town councillors, found a monkey in her living room on one such trip, wearing our clothes like the king of the house. For the most part, however, the problem is no longer contamination. Only 2.4% of the land area of the prefecture remains off-limits to residents. Only 36,811 people, or 2.1% of the population, are still unable to return home. Just one worker has died from direct radiation exposure. Cancer rates in the region have not spiked. Ambient radiation in most of the prefectures is comparable with other cities in Japan and around the world. The health risks are much less acute than what was feared in the disaster's aftermath. In retrospect, it was the chaotic evacuation that probably harmed public health the most. In Fukushima Prefecture, 2,317 people died as a result of it, mostly because of disruption to medical care or suicide. That is more than the 1,606 who perished during the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown themselves. Some researchers argue the government should not have ordered a large-scale evacuation at all, or should have limited it to weeks rather than years. Yet it would have been hard to tell a fearful population faced with the invisible threat of radiation to stay put or return quickly. The meltdown destroyed confidence in experts. The lack of candor from officials in the early weeks and months after the disaster sapped trust in the authorities, pushing citizens to fill the gaps themselves. There were so many things that weren't convincing, so we decided to get our own, says Kobayashi Tomoko, an inn owner and radiation monitor from Minamisoma, a city north of the plant. Even when the government lifted evacuation orders years later, putting an end to compensation payments for residents of those areas, some protested against what they saw as a ploy to force people to return under unsafe conditions. Sensitivity to radioactivity depends on mindset. It's difficult to treat as a matter of policy, says Io Jun of the Reconstruction Design Council, a government advisory panel set up after the disaster. There are more emotional elements. In the past decade, the government's efforts at reconstruction have focused on infrastructure and decontaminating land. Official presentations teem with graphics showing rebuilt roads and railways. Fully 96% of the planned public works have been completed. Millions of tons of waste from the disaster have been removed, including millions of cubic meters of radioactive topsoil. Recovery by these measures is progressing well. The Olympic Games, originally scheduled for 2020 but delayed until this summer owing to COVID-19, are meant to be the culmination of the area's rehabilitation. The government has promoted them as the Recovery Olympics and plans to begin the torch relay in Fukushima at a stadium that became a base for disaster relief in 2011. The flame will pass through Okuma, Iitate, and Minamisoma on its way to Tokyo. Yet, the emphasis on physical reconstruction misses the point. People's hearts and spirits are not only not recovering, they're being lost even more, laments Sakurai Katsunobu, who was mayor of Minamisoma during 3/11. Rates of depression and anxiety among residents of Fukushima are more than double the national average. Diseases such as diabetes and hypertension have become more common, presumably because of continuing anxiety and disruption. Families have been separated and livelihoods lost. Real recovery is not about making buildings, not about physical things, says Ms. Kawata. Who is this infrastructure being built for? Asks Mr. Sakurai. Many of those ordered to evacuate in the aftermath of the disaster, as well as others who fled the region of their own accord, have stayed away. In the areas where evacuation was ordered, only a quarter or so of the population has returned, mostly the elderly. As elsewhere in rural Japan, the prefecture's population had been falling anyway, dipping by an average of 100,000 people in the 9 years preceding the disaster. But 3/11 has accelerated the decline. In the 9 years since, the population has fallen by an average of 180,000 a year. Rebuilding communities has proved far trickier than repaving roads. The current Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide has promised to make Japan carbon neutral by 2050, so he wants to build more wind farms and solar plants, but also to restart more of the idled nuclear reactors. Zero carbon by 2050 means we need nuclear, argues Toyoda Masakazu, who chairs the Institute of Energy Economics, a think tank in Tokyo. Some towns are eager to go nuclear again. After 5 or 6 years, people started thinking about how much risk we can bear in terms of economic growth. says Noz Yutaka, mayor of Takahama, which recently became the first town to approve the restart of a nuclear plant that is more than 40 years old, the standard regulatory lifetime in Japan. The nuclear industry insists it has learned the lessons of 311. TEPCO says that the expectation of perfection, which stifled the reporting of problems, has been swept away. It and other power companies have poured billions of dollars into new seawalls, filter systems, and other safety features. Local governments have drawn up proper evacuation plans. Before Fukushima, it was assumed that if government officials are creating plans, accidents are bound to happen, so no one made plans, Mr. Noz says. Now we have one. The existence of risk is not a reason to abandon a technology, argues TEPCO's Anegawa Takafumi. In ancient times, Prometheus gave us fire, and many people die from fires, but we accept that. Anti-nuclear activists hold that the risks of using nuclear power in Japan, one of the world's most seismically active countries, are prohibitive. Using technology that has the potential to destroy your society is insane. That's the risk we're talking about, says Sean Burney of Greenpeace, a pressure group. The sudden promotion of nuclear power as climate-friendly strikes many in Fukushima as cynical. We shouldn't have to choose between climate disaster and nuclear disaster, says Muto Ruiko, a local anti-nuclear campaigner. There is plenty of scope, anti-nuclear campaigners point out, to generate more renewable energy. After 311, the government introduced incentives for renewables and liberalized the electricity market. Though renewables now provide more than 20% of Japan's power, their share would be higher still, argues Ida Tetsunari of the Institute for Sustainable Energy Policies. If the regional retail monopoly's grip on the grid was loosened further and connections between regions expanded. He says a reform that came into force last year, obliging the big utilities to manage generation and transmission as separate units, has had little effect. Local utilities, people still use the same name card, the same email address, says Mr. Ida. The grid must become more independent. Plans released late last year foresee 50 to 60% of generation coming from renewables in 2050, with nuclear or fossil fuel plants, with carbon capture technology providing the remainder. A clearer picture is expected this summer when the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry releases a new triennial strategy for power generation. The minister, Kajiyama Hiroshi, has expressed support for more nuclear power. Even those who favor a renewable-powered Japan in the long term may accept a handful of restarts now if that means closing coal-fired plants more quickly. Getting new reactors built would be much trickier, however, seeing that most Japanese people are against nuclear power. In either case, oversight will fall to the NRA, which was set up specifically to prevent the sort of chumminess with utilities that allowed the failings at Fukushima Daiichi to go undetected or uncorrected. Fuketa Toyoshi, the NRA's chairman, is careful not to get embroiled in politics. We believe we have to be independent of discussions in energy policy. Unfortunately for the NRA and policymakers, one seismic change that has endured since 311 is a loss of faith in institutions in general. A yearly survey by Edelman, a public relations firm, found that the share of Japanese expressing trust in their government plunged from 51% before the disaster to 25% after. It now stands at 37%. This is the key problem, the loss of trust, says Asmi Brown of Safecast, an NGO in Tokyo that spearheaded independent efforts to monitor radiation after the disaster. Trust is not a renewable resource.